3 years ago, I left our company on a stretcher, trusting my husband to guard the dream we built. 3 years later, I returned with hot food, only to hear his aide ask the executive floor, "Who's this to bring food to my lover?" The deepest cut was not her insolence, but his silence. Soon, all of Chicago will know that humiliating moment was not my collapse. It was the exact second his fake empire started digging its grave. My name is Luna Cruz. I am 36 years old, a Latina woman who spent the better part of her 20s building an empire from a folding table in a dusty warehouse. Now, I was standing on the pavement of downtown Chicago, staring up at the glass monolith that I had helped buy. It had been exactly 3 years since I last stepped through those revolving doors. 3 years since I was carried out on a stretcher, my body failing from severe complications after donating a kidney to my younger sister. What was supposed to be a routine recovery spiraled into a prolonged physical breakdown, dragging my mental health down into a dark, suffocating abyss. I spent those 36 months fighting my way back to the surface, believing the whole time that my husband, Grant, was keeping our shared dream safe. The automatic doors slid open, exhaling a breath of chilled, recycled air. The moment I crossed the threshold, the foreignness of the place hit me like a physical blow. When Grant and I co-founded the firm, our headquarters was a symphony of natural light and open spaces, designed to foster collaboration. We were builders. Now, the lobby was draped in heavy shadows and aggressive, slate-gray panels. Frosted glass partitions had been erected everywhere, cutting off sightlines. There were new layers of security, turnstiles with biometric scanners, and guards standing with their hands folded over their belts. The atmosphere had shifted. It no longer felt like a place where things were created. It felt like a vault where things were hidden. I approached the front desk. The receptionist was young, polished, and completely unfamiliar. I offered her a warm, albeit nervous, smile and stated my name, expecting the usual flurry of recognition, or at least a call up to the executive floor announcing the return of the co-founder. Instead, she asked for my driver's license with the bored detachment of a traffic cop. She typed something into her sleek terminal, her perfectly manicured fingers clicking rhythmically. A moment later, the machine hummed, spitting out a temporary badge on a cheap lanyard. I looked down at the plastic square. Beneath my name, printed in bold, undeniable letters, were the words, "Guest Access." I traced the raised ink with my thumb. A guest. In the house I poured the foundation for. It was not an administrative oversight. It was a deliberate, calculated erasure. I rode the elevator up to the executive suite, my stomach tying itself into intricate knots. The doors chimed open, and there he was, Grant Mercer, my husband. The man I had shared late-night takeout with on the floor of our first cramped office, celebrating our very first civic logistics contract. He was standing in the corridor, looking immaculate in a tailored suit that cost more than our first car. I stepped forward, my body instinctively bracing for an embrace, a kiss, a sigh of relief that his wife and partner had finally returned to his side. Instead, Grant stiffened. He did not reach out to hold me. He extended his right hand, flat and formal, exactly the way he would greet a hostile vendor. I stared at his hand for a fraction of a second before taking it. His grip was brief, lacking any trace of warmth. "Luna," he said, his voice coated in a thick layer of fake, practiced patience. "You should have told me you were coming in today. Things have changed around here." I looked past his shoulder. Mounted on the wall behind the reception desk was a massive, backlit logo forged from brushed steel. It did not read Gridline Civic Logistics, the name we had chosen together on a napkin at a diner at 2 a.m. The wall proudly declared, Mercer Axis Group. My breath caught in my throat, but I forced my facial muscles to remain perfectly still. While I was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to monitors and fighting through a fog of heavy painkillers and depression, Grant had not just kept the seat warm, he had quietly rebranded our entire operation. He had restructured the legal entities, completely erasing the identity we built together, and erected a shiny new monument to himself. There was not a single trace of my sweat, my vision, or my legacy left on that wall. "I can see that," I replied, my voice dangerously steady. "The board and I have had to make a lot of pivots to survive the last 36 months, Grant continued, slipping his hands into his pockets, trying to appear casual. "We have scaled up your old role, the way we used to do things. It is just not a fit anymore. The ecosystem is entirely different." He was speaking to me in corporate buzzwords. He was managing me. Instead of guiding me toward our shared corner office, Grant gestured for me to follow him down a different hallway. We bypassed the executive suites entirely, descending into the belly of the operational floors. He led me to the bid analysis department, a high-traffic, noisy area. He stopped in front of a cramped particle board desk pushed flush against the wall. It was situated directly next to a bank of heavy-duty industrial printers that hummed and clacked incessantly, right across from the main supply closet. It was the absolute lowest tier of real estate in the building, a spot reserved for entry-level temps or interns. "We will set you up here for now," Grant said smoothly, not meeting my eyes. "Get you reacquainted with the basics. Take it slow. Your health is the priority. After all," he was weaponizing my illness, framing my demotion as an act of spousal mercy. I sat down slowly in the cheap mesh chair. Through the glass walls of the surrounding cubicles, I caught sight of a few familiar faces, people who had been with us since the early days. A senior logistics planner I had personally hired, an operations manager I had mentored. They saw me. I saw the flash of recognition, followed immediately by pity, but neither of them smiled. Neither of them moved a muscle to come over and say hello. They quickly dropped their heads, their eyes darting nervously toward the glass-walled supervisor offices before gluing their attention back to their monitors. The silence was deafening. It told me everything I needed to know about the last 3 years. Grant had not simply consolidated corporate power, he had engineered an atmosphere of absolute terror. He had built a culture where simply greeting the forgotten co-founder was viewed as an act of professional suicide. The loyalty I had cultivated through shared struggles and mutual respect had been systematically uprooted and replaced with cold, hard fear. Grant offered a tight, dismissive nod and walked away, the sharp click of his leather shoes fading down the corridor, leaving me entirely alone in a room full of people. A lesser woman might have shattered in that moment. I could have stormed into his office, smashed the glass trophies on his pristine desk, and screamed until my throat bled. I could have demanded the respect I had earned, crying about the injustice of being discarded by the man I loved, but the cold, sterile air of Mercer Axis Group had a strange, clarifying effect on me. The pain of the betrayal was there, a jagged stone sitting heavy in my chest, but I refused to let it bleed out onto the cheap carpet. I placed my handbag on the plastic desk. I did not make a scene. I simply sat there, perfectly still, letting my eyes adjust to the new, dark reality of my life. I became a ghost in the machine. I started to watch. My gaze swept across the floor, sharp and clinical as a surgeon's scalpel. I observed the layout of the room. I memorized the locations of the new biometric locks on the server room doors. I noted the color-coded lanyards that dictated who had access to which floors. I watched the nervous ticks of the mid-level managers as they hurried past, clutching redacted files. I studied the names on the frosted glass doors, noting who had been promoted, who had vanished, and who had been brought in to replace them. Grant thought he was humiliating me by putting me in the trenches. Right next to the printers in the supply closet, he thought he was rendering me invisible. He forgot that the trenches are where all the garbage is kept, where the paper trails are printed, where the whispers are exchanged when the executives are not looking. He forgot that I was the one who designed the original routing algorithms that made this company a fortune. I know how to track moving parts. He wanted me to be a guest. He wanted me to be small, compliant, and broken by my own fragile biology. But as I sat there, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical thud of the heavy-duty printer churning out pages of modified contracts, a profound, icy clarity washed over me. I was not going to fight him for a desk, or a title, or a place in his bed. If I wanted to take back what was rightfully mine, if I wanted to dismantle this fake, stolen empire, I could not just scratch at the surface. I had to understand the architecture of his lies. I had to know exactly what this new, fortified company was so desperate to hide. And from this cramped, noisy little corner in the shadows, I was going to watch every single crack in his foundation until I found the exact spot to plant the dynamite. By 11:45 in the morning, the mechanical rhythm of the supply area had become a numbing drone. I sat at my particle board desk, staring at the blank screen of a locked terminal. My stomach gave a hollow ache, reminding me of the time. It also reminded me of an old, stubborn habit. Whenever Grant was deep in the trenches of a restructuring phase or a massive bidding war, he would forget to eat. Back when we were hungry upstarts, I would physically force a sandwich into his hands at 2 o'clock in the afternoon just to keep him from passing out. It was a reflex, a primal urge built over a decade of partnership. Before leaving Tessa's house this morning, I had packed a thermos of homemade chicken soup and a heavy deli sandwich. I did it out of instinct, perhaps laced with a bitter sense of irony, a test to see if any shred of the man I married remained beneath the expensive tailored suits and the frosted glass. I picked up the insulated bag. The nylon handles felt rough against my palms. I navigated the labyrinth of cubicles, ignoring the side eyes from the junior analysts, and made my way to the elevator bank. I swiped my temporary card. The light flashed red, then green, granting me grudging access to the executive lounge on the 50th floor. The doors parted with a soft chime. The executive lounge of Mercer Axis Group was a sprawling, open-concept monument to corporate excess. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the Chicago skyline. The air smelled of roasted espresso beans and expensive leather. It was a space designed for casual power plays, where million-dollar handshakes happened over sparkling water. I stepped onto the plush carpet, my presence barely registering against the hum of low-stakes chatter among the vice presidents and senior directors scattered across the velvet armchairs. I scanned the room. I found him in the far corner, bathed in the harsh midday sunlight pouring through the glass, Grant. But he was not reviewing quarterly projections or poring over logistics manifests. He was sitting on a low-slung, imported sofa, and he was not alone. Beside him sat a woman who looked like she had been engineered in a laboratory specifically to replace me. She was significantly younger, perhaps 26 or 27. Her hair was a flawless cascade of dark silk, her posture impeccable in a designer cream sheath dress that screamed new money. It was not just her proximity to him that made my blood turn to ice. It was her body language. She was leaning into his personal space, her shoulder brushing his, her hand resting casually on the armrest of his chair, her fingers dangerously close to his wrist. She possessed an unmistakable proprietary ease. She was acting like a woman who had the absolute right to step into his life, occupy his space, and command his attention without ever asking for permission. A sick, heavy realization settled in the pit of my stomach. This was the new executive assistant I had heard whispers about from the break room, Sienna Vale. I walked toward them. The distance felt like miles, every step amplifying the pounding of my own heart against my ribs. Yet, on the outside, I moved with an eerie, glacial calmness. I did not storm over. I glided. As I approached the glass coffee table situated between them, neither of them noticed me at first. They were too engrossed in whatever murmured conversation they were having. I unzipped the nylon bag. I pulled out the stainless steel thermos. It was still radiating a faint heat. I placed the thermos squarely on the center of the glass table. The heavy metallic thud cut through their intimate bubble like a gunshot. The gesture was entirely deliberate. As the metal hit the glass, a ghost of a memory flashed behind my eyes. I remembered sitting cross-legged on the raw concrete floor of our first empty warehouse, peeling back the cardboard flaps of greasy takeout boxes, laughing with Grant about how we did not even have a proper sign above the door yet. We had nothing but a routing algorithm I had coded and a shared hunger. I placed the food down now exactly as I had done 1,000 times before. Grant snapped his head up. The color drained from his face so fast, he looked as if he were about to faint. His jaw slacked, his eyes widening in a sudden, visceral panic. Sienna Vale, however, did not flinch with guilt. She looked up at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disdain. Her perfectly shaped eyebrows drew together. She looked at the worn nylon bag in my hand, then at my sensible, flat shoes, and finally at my face, which bore the subtle, permanent fatigue of a woman who had spent months fighting for her life in a hospital bed. She clearly categorized me in a fraction of a second. A delivery driver who had somehow bypassed security, or perhaps an unhinged subordinate harboring a pathetic crush on the CEO. She leaned back against the leather sofa, crossing her long legs, and let out a sharp, theatrical sigh of annoyance. Then, she opened her mouth and spoke. Her voice was bright, piercing, and perfectly projected to carry across the open lounge. "Who is this to bring food to my lover?" The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Instantly, the entire executive lounge froze. The low hum of corporate chatter died. The espresso machine hissed, sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden vacuum of silence. Vice presidents paused with porcelain cups halfway to their mouths. Directors stopped typing on their tablets. Every single pair of eyes in the vicinity snapped toward the corner sofa. I did not gasp. I did not recoil. The sheer audacity of her statement washed over me, but it was not what stopped my breath. The true shock, the blade that slipped directly between my ribs and twisted, came from the man sitting beside her. I looked at Grant. I waited. I gave him 2 full seconds, then 3, then 4. I waited for the instinctual panic of a husband caught in a lie. I waited for him to jump up, to shove her away, to stammer out a frantic denial. I waited for him to look at the room full of his top executives and say, "That is my wife." He did nothing. He sat there, paralyzed, a pathetic statue carved out of cowardice. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He was completely trapped in the headlights of his own deceit, too terrified of losing his carefully constructed facade to defend the woman who had quite literally given up pieces of her own body to keep his dreams alive. I did not raise my hand to strike her. I did not scream hysterically. I did not let a single tear breach the rim of my eyes. Anger of that magnitude does not explode. It crystallizes. I turned my gaze away from the girl and locked eyes with Grant. I looked at him for a long, terrible moment, letting him see the exact second his marriage died and my war began. When I finally spoke, my voice was not a shout. It was a whisper, smooth and lethal, carrying perfectly in the dead silent room. "Aren't you going to introduce her to the person who built the operational models that won half the contracts in this room?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a carefully curated reality shattering into a million jagged pieces. Across the lounge, a junior account manager, sitting frozen by a potted ficus, slowly lowered his smartphone. The camera lens was pointed directly at us. He was recording. The red light blinked steadily. No one made a move to stop him. No one dared to breathe. They were all collectively realizing that there was something deeply structurally rotten at the core of the Mercer Axis empire, and the foundation had just cracked wide open. Sienna Vale's haughty expression faltered. The color rushed into her cheeks, replacing her arrogance with a sudden, dawning confusion. She looked at Grant, waiting for him to shut me down, to call security, to do anything. When he only stared at the table, a flicker of genuine fear crossed her eyes. In that split second, the polished, confident mistress realized she might not be the queen of the chessboard. She was just a pawn who had blindly stepped onto a battlefield she did not understand. I did not wait for an answer. I did not need one. The thermos sat on the table, an anchor of my past, a monument to everything he had thrown away. I turned my back on them. I walked out of the lounge with the same measured, silent grace I had used to enter. I left Grant pinned to the sofa, suffocating under the weight of his own public humiliation and the terrifying certainty that his darkest secrets were no longer safe. I left the food getting cold. I left the room breathless. I walked straight toward the elevator, the cold fire of vengeance burning brilliantly in my chest. Instead of ordering my driver to head back to the sprawling, glass-walled penthouse I shared with the chief executive officer, I gave him an address on the quiet north side of the city. I was not going home. Home was a museum of a marriage that no longer existed, a curated exhibit of lies I had blindly funded. I needed a war room. I found it at Tessa Rowan's townhouse. Tessa was my oldest friend, a fierce corporate litigator who knew my soul better than anyone. When she opened her heavy oak door, she took one long look at my rigid posture and the absolute deadness in my eyes. She did not offer me a tight hug, and she certainly did not offer me platitudes about how things would get better. She knew exactly what I needed. She simply stepped aside, pointed toward her secluded guest study, and handed me a fresh legal pad. My phone vibrated relentlessly against the mahogany desk in the study. 32 missed calls, 19 unread text messages. Grant was in full panic mode. The screen lit up every few seconds with his frantic attempts at damage control. He typed long, desperate paragraphs, claiming that his assistant had completely misunderstood the dynamic, that she was just an overly ambitious junior staffer who misspoke under the crushing pressure of the fourth quarter fiscal close. He swore it was a catastrophic misunderstanding, but the sheer volume of his messages, the rapid-fire frequency of his excuses, broadcasted his guilt louder than a confession. He was not a husband trying to soothe his traumatized wife. He was a guilty executive frantically trying to plug a massive leak before his board of directors caught wind of the scandal. I ignored every single notification. I pushed the device to the edge of the desk. Instead of engaging in a pathetic argument with a liar, I opened my laptop and typed in a name I had not searched for in nearly 2 years, Mara Ellison. Mara used to be our chief compliance officer. She was a woman who navigated the corporate world strictly through risk assessments, forensic audit trails, and a moral compass forged from solid iron. Roughly 18 months into my grueling medical leave, Grant had abruptly forced her into a heavily restricted early retirement, citing vaguely defined creative differences and a need to modernize the operational structure. I knew better now. Grant did not fire her because she was obsolete. He fired her because she was looking too closely at the books. I found her personal number and dialed. I asked her to meet me at Tessa's house. Mara arrived exactly 45 minutes later, marching up the front steps, carrying a battered leather briefcase that looked heavy enough to hold a cinder block. We sat down at the heavy oak dining table. The late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting long, sharp shadows across the surface, turning the room into an interrogation chamber. "I was genuinely wondering how many months it would take for you to finally wake up and call me," Mara stated flatly. She did not offer a polite greeting. She simply unlatched the brass buckles of her briefcase and slid a thick, heavily tabbed manila folder across the polished wood. I pulled the folder toward me and flipped it open. Inside lay a mountain of legal filings, incorporation papers, and heavily redacted board resolutions. Mara leaned forward, her voice dropping into a clinical, forensic cadence that chilled me to the bone. "Let us start with the foundation of his theft," she began. She meticulously explained the timeline. During the first 6 weeks following my kidney donation surgery, my body had violently rejected the recovery process. I was practically comatose, floating on a dangerously high dosage of prescription narcotics and aggressive immunosuppressants. During that exact window of vulnerability, Grant had casually strolled into my hospital room with a smiling notary public. He had presented me with a thick stack of papers, soothingly whispering that they were just standard medical insurance releases and routine operational sign-offs to keep the lights on while I rested. I had trusted him blindly. I had signed exactly where he pointed. "You did not sign insurance releases, Luna," Mara said, tapping a clawed fingernail against a copy of a notarized document. "You signed a temporary power of attorney, a highly specific legal instrument that granted him unilateral authority over your shares." I stared at my own shaky, medication-induced signature at the bottom of the page. Grant had weaponized my signature while I was hooked up to a morphine drip. He had used that legal proxy to authorize a massive corporate restructuring. He drafted board resolutions that authorized the issuance of millions of new shares into the company pool. He effectively diluted my original 50% founder equity down to a mathematically insignificant fraction, stripping me of all my voting rights and operational veto power before I could even walk unassisted. The betrayal carved a hollow space in my chest, but I forced myself to keep reading. The theft did not stop at my shares. I turned the page and found the intellectual property transfer agreements. My proprietary routing models, the exact civilian logistics algorithms I had coded by hand over hundreds of sleepless nights in our first unheated office, had been legally reassigned. They were no longer the shared intellectual property of our original partnership. Through a series of convoluted shell transfers, Grant had officially registered them as the exclusive copyrighted assets of Mercer Axis Group. My name, my foundational architecture, had been meticulously scrubbed from every metadata file, every source code registry, and every patent application. He had completely erased my professional existence. But that is just the corporate paperwork, Mara continued, her tone growing darker as she pulled a second, much thinner file from her briefcase. Look at the capitalization table. I scanned the rows of shareholder names and equity distributions. Right beneath the executive board members, nestled quietly under a restricted performance bonus tier, was a name that made my jaw clench: Sienna Vale. She was not just collecting an inflated salary to sit in the executive lounge and play the devoted lover. Grant had actively granted her a substantial, vested equity package. He was literally slicing up the very company I had built with my own hands and using it as a private fund to compensate his mistress. And now we get to the really ugly part, Mara whispered, leaning back in her chair. The part that actually got me fired. The true poison, she explained, was running deep within the operational ledger. According to the preliminary internal audit she had secretly tried to run before Grant abruptly locked her out of the servers, the newly rebranded company was securing massive municipal contracts by presenting my flawless, highly efficient operational models in their bid proposals. City planners loved the projections, but once the ink dried on those multi-million-dollar contracts, Grant was not deploying our vetted, unionized fleet. He was quietly subcontracting the actual physical labor out to a hidden network of shadow vendors. These were obscure shell companies operated by his country club associates. They utilized incredibly cheap, completely unregulated labor, bypassing every single safety protocol and quality assurance check in the book. Grant was artificially inflating the profit margins by cutting dangerous corners on civic infrastructure projects and then pumping phantom invoices back through the accounts payable department to wash the money. He was not just a cheating husband manipulating marital assets. He was the architect of a beautifully packaged, highly illegal corporate fraud scheme. I closed the folders. The heavy thud of the cardboard echoed in the quiet room. I rested my hands flat against the cool wood of the dining table. The emotional devastation that had gripped me in the executive lounge that morning had completely evaporated. It was gone, replaced instantly by the razor-sharp, freezing focus of an auditor who had just found the fatal discrepancy in the ledger. Grant fully expected me to react like a scorned woman. He was sitting in his office right now, bracing for hysterical tears, public screaming matches, and a messy, highly emotional divorce settlement. He was counting on me to be erratic. He wanted me to act out so he could effortlessly paint me to the board of directors as the unstable, sick wife who simply could not handle the immense pressure of his corporate success. I absolutely refused to give him that satisfaction. I was not going to strike back at him using the pathetic, predictable language of jealousy or heartbreak. I was not going to fight him over a marriage that was clearly a hollow lie. I was going to dismantle his entire existence using the only language he truly respected and fundamentally feared. I would crush him with server logs. I would bury him under time-stamped original source code. I would strangle him with his own banking chains, illicit vendor contracts, and stolen voting rights. I was going to meticulously build a legal and financial narrative so incredibly precise, so completely grounded in indisputable, hard facts, that absolutely no one on his precious board of directors would be willing to risk prison time to save him. The war had officially shifted. It was no longer a battle over a broken marriage. It was a hostile takeover of my own life. For the next 72 hours, Mara and I did not sleep. We traded the sleek, sterile boardrooms of downtown Chicago for the gritty, unpolished corners of the city and its sprawling suburbs. We were hunting ghosts. The people Grant had systematically purged from the payroll over the last 3 years were not just disgruntled former employees. They were the load-bearing pillars of the original company, the ones who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. We needed them, and more importantly, we needed their records. Our first stop was an auto repair shop in a dusty industrial park on the south side. The smell of motor oil and burning metal hung heavy in the air. Beneath a hydraulic lift, wrenching on the undercarriage of a rusted sedan, was Darius Cole. Darius used to be our head of operations. He was a man who commanded a fleet of heavy-duty transport trucks with military precision, and Grant had unceremoniously dumped him just 6 months after my surgery. Darius wiped his grease-stained hands on a rag as we approached. He did not look surprised to see us. We stood by a stack of bald tires while he laid out the operational collapse of the company. Grant had entirely gutted our standard, union-backed supply chain. Instead of using the reliable, fully insured freight networks we had spent years cultivating, Grant had quietly transitioned all of our major logistical accounts to a handful of bottom-tier, fly-by-night vendors. These new contractors had personal, off-the-books ties to Grant. They employed underpaid, non-union drivers and drove trucks that barely passed state emission inspections. Darius explained that projects were constantly running 3 to 4 weeks behind schedule, but the internal routing logs were being doctored. Grant was artificially suppressing the operational costs by using these cheap, dangerous vendors, making the quarterly profit margins look spectacularly healthy to the board of directors, while entirely compromising the safety and integrity of the deliveries. From the grease-stained garage, we drove to a brightly lit, generic chain coffee shop in the West Loop to meet Felicia Ward. Felicia had been our lead proposal specialist, a woman with a brilliant mind for government contracts. She sat across from us in a vinyl booth, nervously stirring her black coffee. She slid a thick, unmarked manila envelope across the sticky table. Inside the envelope was a comprehensive list of municipal and state bids our company had won over the past 24 months. The total value of these contracts stretched well into the tens of millions of dollars. Felicia pointed a trembling finger at the executive summaries. Every single one of those massive, lucrative proposals had been won strictly because they featured the highly efficient, proprietary route optimization models that I had personally coded. But when Felicia showed me the internal documentation required by the state procurement office, my blood ran cold. Under the section demanding the name of the chief architect of the operational strategy, my name was completely gone. In its place, stamped in bold black ink across legally binding government documents, was the title, Strategic Office of Sienna Vale. Grant was literally taking the intellectual property I had built from scratch, slapping his mistress's name on the cover page, and selling it to the federal government as her brilliant innovation. The financial picture became even darker when we tracked down Ivy Moran, a former senior payroll administrator, at a gloomy diner near her new apartment. Ivy had a mind like a steel trap for numbers. She drank her tea and detailed the bizarre, erratic cash flow anomalies that had started popping up right around the time Sienna was hired. Ivy recalled processing numerous, highly irregular payouts categorized as retention bonuses and field incentive stipends. These payouts were supposed to be earmarked for exhausted drivers and warehouse managers working overtime. Instead, Ivy tracked the routing numbers. The cash, amounting to hundreds of thousands of dollars, was being funneled into dummy accounts. That money was directly paying for diamond tennis bracelets, luxury ski vacations in Aspen, and the exorbitant monthly lease on a penthouse condo located in the Gold Coast neighborhood. The condo, of course, was registered to a shell corporation closely tied to Sienna's maiden name. Grant was treating the corporate treasury like his personal checking account to fund an illicit lifestyle, classifying his infidelity as a deductible business expense. The final piece of the puzzle, the absolute undeniable proof, came from Owen Briggs. Owen was a brilliant, highly introverted data engineer who had worked side by side with me in the early days. We found him in his basement apartment, surrounded by humming server racks and glowing monitors, when Grant ordered the IT department to wipe my presence from the active corporate network. They formatted the primary drives. But they were arrogant, and they were sloppy. Owen pushed his glasses up his nose and tapped his keyboard, bringing up lines of green code on a black screen. He explained that the old legacy storage systems, the deep archive mirror servers we used back when we were just a startup, had never been fully decommissioned. They were sitting forgotten in a secondary data center. Owen still had his administrative backdoor access. He pulled up the original, untouched backup folders. There, preserved like insects trapped in amber, was the unalterable metadata. The digital timestamps unequivocally proved that the core algorithms Grant was currently passing off as Sienna's genius had actually been created, compiled, and saved by my user account 4 full years ago. Sitting in Owen's cramped apartment, staring at the glowing screens, the full, horrifying scope of the conspiracy finally snapped into focus. This was never just a tragic story about a husband having a cliché affair with his attractive assistant. It was not just about stealing credit. Grant had constructed a massive labyrinthine architecture of corporate fraud. Sienna was merely the shiny, distracting hood ornament on a stolen vehicle. Her inflated equity package and the redirected company funds were simply her reward for being his willing accomplice in the theft of my life's work. But the most dangerous revelation of all came just as we were packing up to leave. Owen casually mentioned a piece of chatter he had intercepted on a secure vendor channel before he was locked out. The house of cards was already beginning to sway in the wind. At least 2 of Mercer Axis Group's largest, most crucial clients had recently initiated quiet, highly confidential audits. They had realized that the actual boots-on-the-ground execution of their logistics networks was disastrously out of sync with the flawless theoretical models promised in the winning bid proposals. They were bleeding money due to Grant's cheap subcontractors, and they were silently preparing massive, multi-million-dollar breach of contract lawsuits. Grant was completely out of time. He was frantically trying to balance a fraudulent ledger while standing on the deck of a sinking ship. I looked at Owen, then at Mara, and thought of Darius and Felicia and Ivy. These were good, hard-working people who had their careers derailed and their reputations tarnished simply because they stood in the way of a liar's greed. They had given me the ammunition I needed, putting themselves at massive legal risk by breaking non-disclosure agreements just to hand me the truth. I stood up in the glow of the server lights and looked Owen directly in the eye. I made him a promise, the exact same promise I had made to Darius, Felicia, and Ivy. I told him that when the dust settled, I was not merely going to take my name back and walk away with a fat divorce settlement. I was going to burn Grant's fraudulent empire to the ground, salt the earth it stood on, and build a brand new, honest company from the ashes. I promised them a place where loyalty meant something, where integrity was the baseline, and where they would all have their seats back at the table. In that single moment, the dynamic fundamentally shifted. They were no longer just frightened ex-employees feeding information to a scorned wife. They had become my army, and we were going to war. It had been barely 48 hours since Mara, Tessa, and I began weaving our net of evidence, but Grant was already sensing the shift in the atmosphere. He could not know exactly who I was speaking to, but a man who builds his entire life on a foundation of lies develops a sixth sense for when the ground starts to give way. When he realized I was not going to quietly accept my demotion or file for a standard, highly confidential divorce, he stopped playing the role of the patient, misunderstood husband. He unsheathed his knives and went straight for my throat, launching a coordinated, suffocating counterattack designed to destroy my credibility before I could even step into a courtroom. His first move was a masterpiece of soft, insidious public relations. On a Tuesday morning, a prominent supply chain business journal published a blind item article online. It did not use my name, but the identifiers were unmistakably clear. The piece detailed the tragic, cautionary tale of a female co-founder in the logistics sector who was tragically failing to adapt to the modern corporate ecosystem after a severe medical incident. The article painted a highly sympathetic portrait of the unnamed chief executive officer who had supposedly carried the burden of the company while his estranged wife battled a prolonged physical and mental collapse. The author, undoubtedly paid off by Grant or his crisis management team, heavily implied that the wife's recent return to the workplace was not a triumphant comeback, but a disruptive, emotionally unstable crusade driven by petty jealousy and post-surgical trauma. Grant did not stop with anonymous articles. He actively began seeding the narrative through back channels at country club dinners and industry networking events. He whispered to our major investors and partners that I had returned to Chicago in a highly fragile state. He took the most terrifying, painful chapter of my life, the grueling months my body spent fighting organ rejection after I gave my own sister a kidney, and twisted it into evidence of my fundamental incompetence. He tried to weaponize my survival, framing my physical vulnerability as a permanent mental defect, but attacking my professional reputation was only his opening gambit. When I continued to ignore his frantic calls, Grant decided to leverage the one thing he knew could genuinely break my composure. He went after our 5-year-old daughter, Rosie. He did not attempt to harm her physically. Grant was far too conscious of his own image to do anything overtly monstrous. Instead, he initiated a campaign of psychological warfare disguised as paternal concern. Out of nowhere, his high-priced family lawyers sent a barrage of aggressive emails demanding immediate, irregular pickup rights at her private preschool. He threatened to have his driver collect her at 2 p.m. on random weekdays, deliberately violating our unspoken custody arrangement. His goal was transparent. He wanted to provoke me into a public, hysterical confrontation in the middle of a school parking lot, allowing him to document the incident and create a legally binding narrative that I was an unstable mother actively alienating a loving father from his only child. I did not give him the satisfaction of a panicked reaction. The moment Tessa read the emails, we locked down the perimeter. I drove straight to the preschool director's office. I sat down with a cup of chamomile tea and calmly presented a certified letter drafted by Tessa. I established a rigid, impenetrable procedural wall. I explicitly outlined that no one, absolutely no one, was authorized to remove Rosie from the premises without my direct, written consent, verified by a secondary phone call. I turned his attempt at emotional extortion into a bureaucratic brick wall, neutralizing his leverage without raising my voice a single decibel. While I was securing my daughter, the universe decided to deliver a massive, unprompted counterstrike against Grant. That evening, Tessa walked into the study and placed her tablet on the mahogany desk. She pressed play. It was the footage from the executive lounge. The junior account manager had not just recorded the incident, he had anonymously leaked it. The video was spreading through the closed WhatsApp groups and private Slack channels of the entire Chicago corporate logistics network like a rampant wildfire. Watching it from a third-party perspective was a surreal experience. The audio was remarkably clear. Sienna's arrogant, theatrical voice echoed from the small speakers, demanding to know who was bringing food to her lover. But Tessa pointed a sharp manicured finger at the screen, drawing my attention away from the girl. "Look at him," Tessa whispered. "Look at the great pioneer of modern logistics." The camera was fixed on Grant. The industry was not sharing this video because they were scandalized by an executive having an affair. Extramarital affairs were practically a cliché in our tax bracket. They were sharing it because of his reaction. The footage captured him standing completely frozen, his face pale and slack. He looked weak, terrified, and utterly paralyzed. He did not utter a single syllable to defend me, but more importantly to the sharks in our industry. He did not utter a single syllable to control the room. The video destroyed his carefully cultivated aura of absolute authority. It proved to every investor, competitor, and board member that the emperor was fundamentally a coward. Despite the circulating video, the annual Great Lakes Logistics Foundation fundraising gala was scheduled for Friday night. Grant was slated to give a keynote address. I knew he expected me to hide in Tessa's guest room, too humiliated by the public spectacle to show my face. Therefore, attending was not a choice. It was a tactical necessity. I arrived at the ballroom of the downtown hotel wearing a perfectly tailored, midnight blue evening gown. I walked into the crowded hall with my spine straight and my chin elevated, completely ignoring the sudden hush and the burning stares that tracked my every movement. I was standing by the Champagne Tower, speaking quietly with a regional distributor who had always respected my early routing models, when Sienna Vale intentionally cut across the room to intercept me. She was draped in an ostentatious emerald silk dress that likely cost more than a mid-level manager's annual salary. She stepped directly into my personal space, holding a crystal flute, a tight, vicious smile plastered across her flawless face. The distributor politely excused himself, sensing the sudden drop in temperature. "I am genuinely surprised to see you out of bed, Luna," Sienna said, her voice dripping with toxic, performative pity. "Given your fragile state, Grant tells me your doctors recommended you stay home and recover for the rest of your life. You really should listen to them. It is quite sad, watching you cling to a world that has moved on without you." She was trying to break me in public, hoping I would throw my drink in her face or scream, providing her with the exact unhinged reaction Grant needed for his narrative. I looked at her. I did not see a rival. I saw a deeply insecure woman wearing stolen jewelry, desperately trying to convince herself she was safe in a burning house. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. I met her gaze with an expression of absolute, freezing calm. "You are very young, Sienna, so I will forgive your lack of basic business acumen," I replied, my tone low, steady, and devoid of any emotion. "But you should learn one fundamental rule of corporate survival. Only a thief is terrified when the owner comes back." I did not wait for her to process the insult. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone by the Champagne Tower, her vicious smile slowly melting into an expression of profound uncertainty. I left the gala early, the stale air of the ballroom making me feel claustrophobic. When I returned to Tessa's townhouse, the war room was dark, illuminated only by the glow of my laptop screen. There was a new, unread message in my encrypted email inbox. The sender address was a string of randomized alphanumeric characters. I clicked it open. It was a single, high-resolution screenshot. I leaned closer to the monitor, my heart suddenly accelerating against my ribs. It was a snapshot of a highly restricted internal calendar belonging to the Chief Technology Officer of Mercer Axis Group. Highlighted in bright red ink, scheduled for exactly 3 days from now, was a massive, system-wide event labeled as routine server maintenance and a legacy data purge. My blood ran cold. Grant knew the audit was coming. The video leak had spooked him, and the pressure from the unhappy clients was mounting. He was no longer just trying to manage the public relations fallout. He had given the kill order. In exactly 72 hours, his IT department was going to permanently wipe the deep archive servers. They were going to overwrite the original metadata, incinerate the source code timestamps Owen had found, and destroy the hidden ledgers tying the shell companies to the corporate treasury. He was preparing to crush the entire architecture of his fraud into irretrievable digital ash. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, the glow of the screen reflecting in my eyes. The luxury of time had officially evaporated. If I waited for the slow, methodical wheels of standard corporate litigation to turn, I would lose everything. The trap was set, but the timer was now ticking down to 0. I had to strike before the servers went dark, or I would spend the rest of my life trying to prove a ghost story. Armed with the encrypted drive Owen had provided, Mara bypassed the external firewalls of the corporate network entirely. She spent the next 14 hours running advanced extraction protocols in the guest study. When she finally turned the monitor toward me, the screen displayed the absolute holy grail of corporate litigation. It was a complete, unredacted directory of the proprietary routing models currently branded with the sleek new company logo. However, running right alongside those heavily polished files was the indisputable, original metadata. The creation logs, the modification histories, and the user keystroke signatures all pointed to a single, undeniable truth. I had built those exact architectural frameworks 4 years ago. The digital fingerprints were undeniably mine, preserved perfectly in the legacy code. Standard legal procedure dictated that we should immediately file a massive, highly public lawsuit and let the federal courts sort out the intellectual property theft. I refused to play by standard procedures. Lawsuits took years of depositions, and Grant possessed deep, corporate-funded pockets to drag out a war of attrition. I wanted to bleed him out right now. I targeted the absolute oxygen supply of his entire operation, the corporate cash flow. I arranged discreet, highly confidential breakfast meetings with the chief procurement officers of two of our most lucrative logistics partners. I chose a quiet, dimly lit restaurant on the edge of the financial district, far away from the places my husband usually held court. I did not bring a lawyer to these meetings. I did not utter a single word about my failing marriage, the infidelity, or the profound personal betrayal. I simply slid a single, meticulously compiled sheet of paper across the linen tablecloth. The document detailed the catastrophic compliance risks they were currently exposed to by contracting with a firm utilizing fraudulent shadow vendors and stolen intellectual property. I spoke their native language. I talked about severe supply chain liability, federal audit exposure, and massive shareholder blowback if the media discovered they were paying a premium for compromised logistical infrastructure. By the end of the week, this quiet strategy yielded its first devastating casualty. A massive strategic client, a national distributor responsible for nearly 18% of the projected annual revenue for our firm, quietly informed the executive committee that they were pausing their upcoming contract renewal indefinitely. They cited a vague need for an internal risk reassessment. It was not a public firing, but the sudden gaping hole in the quarterly revenue forecast was more than enough to send the board of directors into a quiet, cold panic. The smell of financial danger had officially entered the boardroom. With the board suddenly hyper-focused on the bottom line, Tessa unleashed the legal hounds. Exactly 12 hours before Grant's IT department could execute their highly anticipated legacy server wipe, we hit the general counsel of the company with a massive preservation of evidence demand. The legal hold was airtight, explicitly prohibiting the destruction, alteration, or concealment of any digital records, server logs, or financial communications under penalty of severe federal sanctions. The General Counsel, terrified of personal disbarment and federal obstruction charges, immediately ordered the server maintenance canceled. In the exact same courier envelope, we included a formal, legally binding shareholder demand. As a founding partner whose equity had been illegally diluted through a manipulated power of attorney, I was exercising my absolute legal right to conduct a comprehensive inspection of the corporate books. With the data preserved and the financial gates forcefully pried open, Mara and I tore into the ledgers. That was when the first major surprise surfaced from the muddy waters of the accounts payable department. I discovered a recurring, exorbitant monthly outgoing wire transfer. The money was being funneled to an obscure shell entity named Lake Prism Advisors under the vague, highly suspicious classification of strategic consulting fees. Mara traced the routing numbers through a labyrinth of offshore corporate registries. Lake Prism Advisors did not provide consulting. It was a pass-through entity that dumped the company funds directly into a private investment portfolio. That exact portfolio was functioning as the financial engine driving the massive, unearned equity bonus package awarded to his mistress. Grant was systematically siphoning operational capital to play the role of a wealthy benefactor, disguising his outright theft as a legitimate corporate operational expense. The second surprise we uncovered was far more personal, representing a profound insult to the foundational ethics of our original enterprise. I reviewed the specific data sets Grant had used to secure 3 of his most recent, highly publicized municipal contracts. I recognized the numbers and the geographic routing coordinates instantly. Years ago, when we were struggling to build a reputation and barely making payroll, I had orchestrated a massive pilot project for an underfunded, working-class civic district on the south side of the city. I designed a highly complex transit optimization system and deployed it entirely for free, simply because it was the right thing to do and the community desperately needed the infrastructure support. Grant had taken the performance metrics from that exact pro bono charity project, scrubbed the humanitarian context, and repackaged them as premium corporate case studies to win lucrative, high-margin bids. He had not merely stolen my intellectual property, he had cannibalized the very moral compass I used to guide our early success. Late that night, long after Mara and Tessa had retreated to their bedrooms, I sat alone at the heavy oak dining table. I took a fresh piece of heavy stock paper and a black pen. I did not write down aggressive legal strategies or complex financial calculations. Instead, I began sketching a new organizational chart. I outlined the foundational principles for an entirely new logistics firm. I drafted a mission statement focused on absolute transparency, equitable vendor partnerships, and bulletproof supply chain integrity. This midnight exercise was a crucial psychological anchor. It was a private, vital reminder that I was not wading through this toxic, exhausting warfare merely to punish a cheating husband or to claw my way back into a corrupted executive suite. I was fighting to reclaim my fundamental right to define my own professional legacy. I was building the blueprint for my future, ensuring that when the smoke cleared, I had a place to stand. Across the city, Grant was finally feeling the temperature drop in the room. The sudden, inexplicable delay in the contract renewals had forced him to answer highly uncomfortable questions from a very nervous, profit-driven board of directors. The sudden legal hold on the servers meant his carefully planned escape hatch was permanently welded shut. The aggressive demand to inspect the corporate books meant I was coming relentlessly for his shadow ledgers. For 36 months, he had operated under the arrogant assumption that I was a broken, trembling woman who would eventually fade quietly into the background in exchange for a generous, confidential settlement. Now, as the cash flow started to choke and the legal walls rapidly closed in around him, he realized the fatal flaw in his calculus. I was not crying. I was not pleading for my marriage. I was executing a highly calculated, hostile financial siege, stripping him of his leverage piece by piece, and speaking the only language he had ever truly worshipped: profit and risk. The pressure from the impending audit was a heavy, invisible weight that finally cracked the weakest link in the chain. It was late on a Thursday evening when Mara's burner phone vibrated against the mahogany desk. The voice on the other end was brittle, completely stripped of the haughty arrogance that had echoed through the executive lounge just days prior. It was Sienna Vale. She was terrified. Grant was a cornered animal. With the board of directors demanding answers regarding the stalled contracts and the legacy servers securely locked under our legal hold, he desperately needed a scapegoat. Sienna, with her name plastered all over the Lake Prism Advisors equity payouts and the fraudulent strategic office titles, was the perfect sacrificial lamb. She realized the man she thought would elevate her to the top of the corporate ladder was actively preparing to bury her underneath it. Mara arranged a meeting at a desolate, 24-hour diner out by the interstate, miles away from the polished executive lounges of downtown Chicago. I sat deep in the shadows of a cracked vinyl booth, nursing a lukewarm black coffee, while Sienna slid into the seat opposite us. She looked entirely diminished. The designer silk was gone, replaced by an oversized, nondescript cashmere sweater. Her eyes darted nervously toward the window every time headlights swept across the parking lot. Sienna begged for a deal. She offered to turn state evidence, to hand over the internal mechanics of the fraud, in exchange for guaranteed legal leniency when we inevitably took the company down. Then, she tried to play the ultimate victim. She looked me directly in the eye, her voice trembling with manufactured sincerity, and swore that Grant had manipulated her from the very beginning. She claimed he told her I had willingly sold all my founder shares for a massive buyout and simply disappeared to the coast to start a new life. She insisted she truly believed she was merely stepping into a permanent void, completely unaware she was acting as an accomplice in a hostile takeover of my legacy. It was a highly compelling performance, but it was fundamentally flawed. When Mara and I returned to Tessa's war room, we cross-referenced Sienna's tragic narrative with the deep archive server data Owen had salvaged. It took Mara exactly 45 minutes to unearth the absolute truth. We found a chain of encrypted emails between Grant and Sienna, dated during the exact second week of my surgical recovery. The emails explicitly discussed my severe medical incapacitation and the heavy doses of narcotics I was receiving. Sienna knew perfectly well I had never surrendered a single share. She knew I was lying unconscious in an intensive care unit while my legal rights were being actively forged. She was not a naive pawn manipulated by a powerful man. She was a willing vulture circling a wounded animal. I needed to know exactly how venomous she still was. If we were going to use her inside information, I had to test her loyalty under pressure. The next morning, I drafted a highly classified, completely fabricated legal strategy memo. The document outlined a fictitious, desperate plan to attack Grant exclusively on the grounds of marital asset mismanagement, deliberately ignoring the massive corporate routing fraud. I had Mara leak this fake strategy document to Sienna through a supposedly secure back channel, framing it as our primary, last-ditch avenue of attack. We waited in the silence of the study. It took less than 6 hours for the echo to return. Tessa received a hostile, preemptive letter from Grant's outside legal counsel. The letter proactively defended his management of our joint bank accounts and real estate holdings, aggressively countering the exact fabricated arguments I had planted in the decoy memo. The trap snapped shut perfectly. Grant was adjusting his legal armor to protect against a phantom strike. Sienna was actively playing both sides of the board. She was feeding us information to save herself from the impending federal audit, while simultaneously feeding Grant our legal strategies to keep herself in his good graces, just in case he miraculously survived the siege. Despite her treacherous nature, the gamble of meeting her yielded a profound tactical advantage. To prove her value during our diner meeting, Sienna had handed over 2 pieces of actionable intelligence. The first was a deeply personal, terrifying threat. She confessed that Grant kept a hidden, fireproof safe behind the custom mahogany bookshelf in his private home office. Inside that safe were high-resolution copies of my restricted medical files, psychiatric evaluations from my darkest days of post-surgical depression, and devastatingly candid photographs he had taken of me while I was heavily medicated, weeping, and physically broken. He was hoarding my lowest moments. He planned to leak those images to the board of directors and the industry press the moment we stepped into a courtroom, painting a grotesque, irreversible picture of a mad woman to completely destroy my credibility as a competent executive. He never got the chance to pull the trigger. The very next morning, Tessa filed an emergency ex parte motion in family court. Utilizing a strict marital asset preservation clause, she argued flawlessly that Grant was harboring joint property and highly sensitive personal health information in an unsecured, private location, posing an immediate risk of irreparable reputational harm. The judge signed the order within 2 hours. By noon, a court-appointed marshal, accompanied by Tessa, stood in Grant's home office, legally forcing the safe open while he was stuck in a board meeting. They confiscated every single photograph and medical file, placing them immediately under strict judicial seal. We neutralized his dirtiest, most agonizing emotional weapon before he could even reach for the handle. The second piece of intelligence Sienna offered was the golden key to the financial labyrinth. She knew she could not explain the intricate accounting mechanics of the shadow vendors herself, so she threw the man who could directly into the fire. She gave us a name, Blake Wren. Blake was the current chief financial officer of Mercer Axis Group. According to Sienna, Grant gave the broad orders, but Blake was the quiet architect who actually built the plumbing. Blake was the one who meticulously fabricated the fake operational invoices, authorized the inflated wire transfers to the dangerous subcontractors, and sanitized the paper trail before it hit the quarterly reports. Blake held the missing payment vouchers I desperately needed to definitively prove the fraud to the authorities. I sat in the quiet study, staring at Blake Wren's corporate profile on my monitor. The walls were rapidly closing in on the executive floor. The pressure was turning the suite into an incubator of paranoia. The conspirators were beginning to cannibalize each other to survive the rising water. Sienna thought she was playing a brilliant game of 3-dimensional chess, manipulating both me and Grant to secure her own survival and walk away clean. But I saw her exactly for what she was. I decided to use Sienna exactly like a bloody, jagged knife. I would hold her firmly, deploy her at the precise moment to sever Grant's remaining lifelines, and extract every last piece of leverage she possessed. But I would never, for a single fraction of a second, forget that a blade with no handle can easily slice through the hand that wields it. I knew her true nature now. She was a survivor utterly devoid of loyalty, and that fundamental lack of a moral center made her the most dangerously predictable weapon in my entire arsenal. The emergency meeting of the board of directors was convened on a dreary, rain-soaked Thursday morning. The atmosphere inside the 50th floor penthouse boardroom was heavy, suffocating, and thick with an unspoken dread. The sudden, unexplainable decision by a major strategic client to completely freeze their multi-million-dollar contract renewal had triggered a massive internal panic alarm. When my legal counsel formally filed a demand for a comprehensive, independent forensic audit just hours later, the board had no choice but to force the doors open. They were sitting around the massive, polished mahogany table, their faces grim and illuminated by the harsh overhead lighting, waiting for an explanation. Grant walked into the room attempting to project the aura of a weary, embattled visionary. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his expression carefully arranged into a mask of solemn, patient suffering. He stood at the head of the long table, rested his hands on the polished wood, and launched directly into a carefully constructed, highly manipulative soliloquy. He did not talk about logistics algorithms or missing revenue. He immediately framed the entire crisis as a deeply tragic, unavoidable family emergency spilling over into the corporate sphere. He spoke of the grueling 36 months he had spent shouldering the immense, crushing weight of a rapidly expanding enterprise, all while his wife battled catastrophic health complications at home. He painted a vivid, pathetic picture of a husband carrying the world on his shoulders. He cast my recent return to the headquarters, not as a founder reclaiming her rightful place, but as the erratic, bitter crusade of a severely traumatized woman. He implied, with a terrifyingly gentle tone, that I was simply lashing out of jealousy, unable to mentally process or adapt to the modern, sophisticated corporate reality that had evolved beyond my limited comprehension during my medical absence. He literally asked the board for their grace, their understanding, and their patience as he handled this deeply unfortunate, highly personal disruption. I sat halfway down the table. I did not raise my voice to defend my sanity. I did not shed a single tear of outrage, and I absolutely did not engage with the insulting, grotesque caricature of our marriage he had just sketched for the room. Emotional arguments are for people who lack leverage. I simply offered a sharp, singular nod to Mara, who was sitting rigidly to my right. We unzipped our leather briefcases and began sliding thick, heavily tabbed binders across the smooth mahogany surface to every single seated director. I waited for the rustle of turning pages to settle before I spoke. My voice was completely devoid of emotion, echoing off the glass walls like the strike of a gavel. I did not tell them a story about a broken heart. I walked them through the precise, documented architecture of a massive corporate theft. I instructed them to open to the first section. I pointed to the original copyright timestamps and the unalterable metadata Owen had successfully extracted from the legacy servers. I forced them to look at the undeniable proof that the flagship route optimization models, the exact intellectual property currently branded with the new corporate logo and driving their profit margins, were authored entirely by my user account 4 years prior. I then guided their eyes to the next tab. I laid out the financial flowcharts we had meticulously built, tracing the corporate funds directly from the accounts payable department into the obscure shell entity known as Lake Prism Advisors. I explicitly detailed, using their own intercepted ledger entries, how critical operating capital was being aggressively converted into a private, unearned equity package for Grant's administrative assistant. Before Grant could even formulate a coherent lie to explain the existence of the shadow company, Mara leaned forward and delivered the heaviest legal blow of the morning. She directed the board to the third tab. It contained a certified, heavily documented pharmacological timeline retrieved directly from my surgical intensive care unit records. She overlaid that timeline with the exact date and hour Grant had executed the temporary power of attorney. Mara bluntly informed the silent, paralyzed room that I was under heavy, medically induced cognitive impairment, actively receiving intravenous narcotics, when that document was signed. She outlined the terrifying legal reality staring them in the face. The foundational document that authorized the massive corporate restructuring and the subsequent dilution of my 50% founder equity was legally toxic. If a federal judge invalidated that single document, every single corporate action taken over the past 3 years, including the issuance of their own lucrative board compensations and stock options, would be subject to massive, catastrophic legal liability. The mood in the boardroom instantly shifted. The patronizing pity Grant had so carefully cultivated evaporated in a matter of seconds, replaced by raw, self-preserving terror. Corporate directors do not particularly care about broken marital vows or infidelity, but they are absolutely terrified of fiduciary negligence, compromised stock values, and federal indictments. An older board member, a severe silver-haired man named Arthur, who had personally backed our initial seed funding round back when we were operating out of a freezing warehouse, leaned heavily onto the table. He bypassed Grant entirely. Arthur looked directly at the newly exposed equity tables we had provided. He demanded, his voice thick with outrage, to know exactly what operational value a 20-something administrative assistant provided to justify a vested equity package that rivaled a senior vice president, especially when the funds were being actively laundered through an offshore pass-through entity. Grant opened his mouth, his face completely drained of blood. He stammered something incoherent about strategic consulting initiatives and unfortunate workplace misunderstandings, desperately trying to deploy his usual corporate buzzwords. Tessa, sitting quietly in the corner of the room, did not let him finish the sentence. She simply connected her secure tablet to the main boardroom projector. The massive, high-definition screen at the far end of the table flared to life. We played the leaked video from the executive lounge. We played it entirely without sound. The absolute silence made the visual impact infinitely worse. The board of directors sat frozen in their high-backed leather chairs, watching the crisp footage of Sienna Vale leaning aggressively into Grant's personal space. They watched her mouth the word lover with an attitude of absolute, unassailable entitlement. More importantly, they watched their chief executive officer. They watched Grant sit completely paralyzed, offering zero resistance, zero denial, and zero control over the situation. It completely shattered the illusion of a harmless, exaggerated workplace rumor. It was a stark, undeniable visual confession of gross negligence, reckless liability, and catastrophic lack of judgment. It proved that Grant was not a visionary leader carrying a burdened company. He was a compromised liability actively sinking the ship to protect his own pathetic secrets. The board did not deliberate for long. When personal fortunes and professional reputations are placed directly on the chopping block, loyalty evaporates with terrifying speed. Arthur did not even bother to ask Grant to step out of the room. He called for an immediate, emergency vote. The resolution passed unanimously, effective immediately. The board voted to temporarily suspend all financial and operational decision-making authority from both Grant and Sienna. Furthermore, they officially approved our demand for a comprehensive third-party forensic audit of all corporate accounts, vendor contracts, and legacy data servers. To guarantee the integrity of the investigation, the board ordered the immediate locking of Grant and Sienna's access to the core network, their corporate email accounts, and the physical executive suites. Grant stood at the head of the table, his posture completely broken. He stared at me across the expanse of polished wood. The arrogant mask he had worn for 36 months was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, sinking realization that his entire universe had just violently collapsed. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply closed my leather briefcase, stood up from my chair, and buttoned my blazer. I walked out of the heavy double doors, leaving the boardroom in a state of chaotic, panicked scrambling. As I walked down the silent, carpeted hallway toward the elevator bank, I knew with absolute certainty that I had not yet won the final decisive battle. There would be grueling depositions, vicious legal maneuvering, and a bitter divorce to finalize, but a profound, icy satisfaction settled deep into my bones. I had accomplished the most difficult objective of the entire war. I had taken a room full of incredibly powerful people who had comfortably and quietly profited from my silent erasure, and I had forced every single one of them to look down and realize they were standing directly on a trapdoor. And they finally understood that I was the one holding the lever. The moment the boardroom doors clicked shut, the invisible architecture holding Grant's empire together began to violently snap. Being stripped of his executive access was not merely a professional inconvenience, it was the removal of his primary weapon. By 5 o'clock that evening, his biometric credentials had been wiped from the corporate security grid. His corporate email was frozen. The massive server vaults were securely barricaded behind our legal holds and the newly appointed independent auditors. Without the protective shield of his chief executive title, Grant was rapidly suffocating, and the panic made him incredibly reckless. The first signs of his desperation surfaced less than 24 hours later. My phone buzzed while I was reviewing vendor contracts in Tessa's guest study. It was Darius, our former head of operations, calling from his auto repair shop. He sounded more amused than intimidated. Grant had personally driven out to the grimy industrial park on the south side, standing in the middle of a grease-stained garage wearing a $3,000 suit. Grant had desperately tried to buy Darius off. He waved a cashier's check for $50,000 and promised a highly lucrative phantom consulting position if Darius would simply sign a retroactive non-disclosure agreement and refuse to testify about the shadow supply chains. A few hours later, Felicia called in a panic. Grant had left 4 aggressive voicemails on her personal phone, threatening her with ruinous civil litigation and massive financial penalties for allegedly stealing corporate secrets if she cooperated with my legal team. He was frantically running around the city with a bucket of water, trying to put out a forest fire. He did not realize that every single bribe he offered and every single threat he issued was immediately reported back to my war room, adding obstruction of justice and witness tampering to his rapidly expanding list of fatal errors. When the walls begin to crack, the people who helped build the corrupt house are always the first to start trampling each other to reach the exit. The grandest defection came from the man who managed the money. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, Tessa received a highly confidential phone call from a prominent white-collar criminal defense attorney. He was representing Blake Wren, the current chief financial officer of the company. Blake had survived the boardroom massacre, but he was a man who understood numerical risk better than anyone. He had watched Grant get stripped of his power. He knew the independent forensic auditors were scheduled to begin tearing through the accounts payable ledgers on Monday morning. Blake realized that when the auditors found the fraudulent invoices and the offshore wire transfers, his signature would be the one endorsing the felony. Blake was absolutely terrified of going to federal prison. Through his attorney, he offered a total capitulation. In exchange for a guarantee that we would not name him in our primary civil suit, Blake was ready to hand over a fully unencrypted, mirrored backup of his entire hard drive. He had spent his final hours of network access quietly downloading every single piece of damning financial evidence he could carry. When Mara finally unzipped Blake's digital archives, the air in the room grew instantly colder. Up until that exact moment, my battle had been a vicious, high-stakes corporate divorce centered around stolen intellectual property, diluted founder shares, and marital asset mismanagement. Blake's hard drive changed the entire legal landscape. Mara discovered massive, systemic discrepancies in the municipal infrastructure contracts. To inflate the quarterly profit margins and trigger his own executive bonus clauses, Grant had orchestrated a massive overbilling scheme against the city government. The spreadsheets explicitly detailed how the company had invoiced the municipal planning department for over 500 hours of on-site engineering consultations that simply never occurred. They had billed the taxpayers for 40 senior field specialists when only 10 junior contractors had actually been deployed to the civic work zones. I stared at the glowing spreadsheets, feeling the sheer gravity of the situation anchor me to the floor. We had crossed a massive, terrifying threshold. This was no longer just a bitter dispute between a wealthy husband and a betrayed wife. This was systemic, large-scale fraud perpetrated against the public sector. It was enough to trigger a devastating investigation by the Department of Justice and the federal financial regulatory bodies. Grant had not just stolen my company. He had turned my legacy into a criminal enterprise. He must have sensed the absolute finality of his situation, because he abandoned all his proxies and came directly for me. I was walking out of a small, quiet coffee shop 3 blocks from Tessa's townhouse when a black luxury SUV aggressively pulled up to the curb. Grant stepped out. He looked entirely hollowed out. He had not shaved in 2 days. His eyes were bloodshot from severe sleep deprivation, and the arrogant, polished posture he always carried had completely collapsed into a defensive hunch. He cornered me against the brick wall of the cafe. He did not offer a genuine apology. A narcissist facing annihilation does not experience remorse. They only experience the terror of consequences. Instead, he offered a transaction. He spoke rapidly, his voice thick with a pathetic, bargaining desperation. He promised to legally reverse the equity dilution and restore my full 50% voting rights immediately. He offered to dissolve the offshore accounts, fire Sienna before the end of the day, and authorize a massive 8-figure cash settlement directly into my personal accounts. All I had to do was withdraw the audit demands, silence my witnesses, and sign a joint press release stating we had successfully resolved our internal marital restructuring. He wanted me to take the hush money so we could both keep a piece of the reputation and the wealth. I stood perfectly still, letting the cold Chicago wind whip around us. I looked at the man I had once loved deeply, the man I had sacrificed my own physical organs to support, and felt absolutely nothing but a profound, sterile disgust. "You still do not understand a single thing about what is happening right now," I said, my voice completely flat, slicing through his frantic negotiations. I did not spend the last 36 months fighting my way out of a hospital bed just to come back and negotiate a market price for your betrayal. I am not here to take a cut of your stolen money, Grant. I am here to permanently terminate your right to make a living off my back. I walked away, leaving him standing on the pavement, completely paralyzed by the realization that there was absolutely no price I was willing to accept for my silence. The final nail in his coffin was hammered in by the very woman he had used to replace me. In her blind, frantic scramble to save herself from the impending federal fallout, Sienna Vale executed her final, most destructive betrayal. She understood perfectly that if the auditors found her guilty of accepting stolen corporate funds, Grant would immediately throw all the blame onto her administrative shoulders. To prevent him from burying her, she decided to drag him into the grave with her. Sienna sent a single, heavily encrypted audio file directly to Mara's inbox. It was a covert recording she had captured on her smartphone during a chaotic, closed-door meeting between Grant and Blake Wren just hours after the disastrous board intervention. The audio quality was slightly muffled, but the voices were unmistakable. Grant's voice echoed through our laptop speakers, dripping with explicit criminal intent. He was aggressively ordering his chief financial officer to sanitize the ledgers. "I do not care what you have to delete, Blake," Grant's recorded voice hissed. "Clean the operational numbers and shred the vendor invoices before the outside auditors touch them. Burn the Lake Prism files tonight." It was the absolute holy grail of criminal prosecution. It was a recorded, undeniable directive to destroy federal evidence and obstruct a mandated corporate investigation. Sienna had handed us the exact weapon needed to guarantee his total destruction, proving that the only thing stronger than their illicit romance was her absolute instinct for self-preservation. That night, the atmosphere in the war room was entirely different. The frantic, breathless race to gather evidence was over. We were no longer hunting in the dark. We were meticulously organizing the kill. I sat at the heavy oak table, systematically sliding the printed timelines, the legacy source code metadata, the overbilling spreadsheets, and the transcription of the audio recording into pristine, heavily reinforced legal binders. My phone buzzed constantly on the desk. The financial press had finally caught the scent of blood in the water. Reporters from 3 major business journals were leaving urgent voicemails, asking for comments on the rumors of a massive executive lockout and a pending federal inquiry at Mercer Axis Group. The scandal was breaching the hull. I looked at the towering stack of evidence boxes waiting by the door. I knew exactly what tomorrow would demand. The upcoming decisive hearing was not going to be a negotiation, and there would be absolutely no room for mercy or half measures. I had built an inescapable, steel-reinforced trap. Now, I simply had to walk into the room and pull the lever, knowing full well that I either had to bury his fake empire completely, or the resulting explosion would try to drag me down with it. The final arbitration hearing did not resemble a dramatic television courtroom filled with gasping spectators and pounding gavels. It took place in a sterile, windowless conference room on the 42nd floor of a financial district high-rise. The air conditioning hummed with a monotonous, freezing intensity, smelling faintly of lemon polish and ozone. It was not a battle of passionate speeches. It was a highly documented, methodical demolition. The arbitrator, a retired federal judge known for possessing zero tolerance for corporate theatrics, sat squarely at the head of the long oak table. Tessa did not just present our case. She performed a ruthless, forensic autopsy on Grant's entirely fabricated empire. She began by laying down the complete, unbreakable chain of evidence in perfect chronological order. She presented the forged temporary power of attorney, highlighting the exact hour it was signed. She followed that with the original author metadata Owen had so carefully extracted from the deep archive legacy servers, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that I was the sole architect of the core intellectual property. Then, she distributed the financial flowcharts, explicitly linking the accounts payable department to the offshore pass-through entity known as Lake Prism Advisors. Finally, she introduced the crown jewel of our investigation, the decrypted audio recording of Grant actively ordering the destruction of crucial financial ledgers and vendor invoices. Grant, sitting across from me, flanked by 2 highly paid, visibly nervous defense attorneys, looked like a man drowning in extremely slow motion. When the arbitrator finally granted him permission to speak, he desperately played his final, most pathetic card. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with manufactured sorrow, and tried to invoke my medical history one last time. He insinuated that my prolonged physical recovery had left me mentally compromised, prone to paranoid delusions, and completely unfit to understand the complex financial restructuring he had supposedly undertaken to save the company. Tessa did not even wait for his attorney to finish entering the statement into the record. She simply reached into her leather briefcase and slid a certified, heavily stamped medical dossier across the polished table. It contained comprehensive psychiatric and physical evaluations from 3 independent, board-certified specialists, confirming that I had been fully recovered and operating at peak cognitive capacity for over 18 months. Grant's final attempt to smear my sanity instantly transformed into undeniable, documented proof that he had deliberately and maliciously weaponized my past medical trauma to cover his corporate tracks. His own defense attorneys visibly flinched. The wall of silence broke completely when Blake Wren was called to testify. The chief financial officer was sweating profusely, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold his glass of water. Blake understood the math, and he knew he was staring down the barrel of a massive federal indictment. He completely turned on Grant right there in the room. He confirmed, under oath and penalty of perjury, that Grant had directly ordered the fabrication of the municipal invoices to inflate quarterly earnings. He testified that the Lake Prism Advisors account was established at Grant's specific direction solely to launder operational funds. Furthermore, Blake explicitly referred to Sienna's unearned, multi-million-dollar equity package exactly as we suspected, high-level internal hush money meant to secure her silence and complicity in the ongoing fraud. Seeing the financial architect flip and hand over the blueprints to his crimes, Grant completely panicked. He tried to subtly redirect the blame, implying to the arbitrator that Sienna had drastically overstepped her administrative boundaries and initiated the legacy server purge and the shadow vendor contracts entirely on her own. Hearing him throw her under the bus, Sienna completely lost her mind. The polished, arrogant facade she had worn so proudly in the executive lounge shattered into a million jagged pieces. She leaped up, her heavy wooden chair scraping violently against the carpet, and started screaming her testimony across the room. She confessed that Grant had manipulated the entire narrative from the very beginning. She looked wildly at the arbitrator, her face flushed with rage and terror, and testified that Grant had explicitly instructed her. If Luna comes back, just make her look like a woman who can no longer distinguish between business and marriage. The final, devastating twist of the knife came from Owen Briggs. Our quiet, brilliant data engineer had not just found the old historical metadata, he presented a fresh, highly classified system log directly to the arbitrator. The log definitively proved that exactly 12 minutes after I placed that hot thermos of chicken soup on the table in the executive lounge, Grant and Sienna had frantically accessed an emergency strategic folder on the main server. The keystroke logs showed them actively preparing a script to digitally incinerate the source code evidence and drafting the exact public relations narrative of my supposed mental instability. It proved absolute, undeniable, real-time premeditation. The legal fallout was explosive, immediate, and completely catastrophic for Grant. The arbitrator declared the original equity dilution completely void due to fraudulent execution. The core intellectual property rights, the very algorithms that kept his massive fleet of trucks running, legally reverted to my sole ownership. Grant was permanently stripped of his executive authority, his board seat, and barred from entering the premises. Sienna was stripped of her entire vested equity package, leaving her with absolutely nothing but a severely tarnished reputation and massive legal bills she could never afford to pay. The extensive documentation regarding the overbilling and financial fraud was immediately forwarded to the federal regulatory agencies for deep-level criminal prosecution. Grant was no longer just a fired chief executive officer. He was a man staring down the realistic prospect of spending the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary. This total corporate victory cascaded directly into family court. Because I possessed ironclad, publicly recorded proof that Grant had simultaneously committed adultery, embezzled joint marital assets, and manipulated our corporate holdings, I gained the absolute upper hand in the divorce settlement. I did not have to fight for scraps. I secured full, primary custody of our daughter Rosie, along with an impenetrable wall of protective orders designed to completely shield her from any future manipulative pressure, unannounced visits, or emotional extortion from her father. But the end of the story did not stop with Grant's spectacular collapse. I had absolutely no desire to sit on the throne of a poisoned kingdom. Mercer Axis Group was a contaminated brand, built on a foundation of shadow vendors and stolen valor. Instead of trying to salvage the tainted company, I sold the hollowed-out carcass of Mercer Axis to an aggressive, New York-based corporate restructuring firm. I let them deal with the impending federal fines, the toxic subcontracts, and the messy public relations nightmare. I kept only 3 things from the wreckage: my original, clean data, my proprietary intellectual property, and the handful of loyal, brilliant people who had risked everything to help me expose the truth. With those pure assets, I built something entirely new from the ground up. I named it Cruise Corridor Studio. Today, I am sitting in my new corner office. There are no heavy, slate-gray panels or frosted glass barriers designed to hide secrets here. The space is completely open, flooded with warm, natural sunlight pouring through the massive windows. The air smells heavily of freshly brewed artisan coffee and the crisp, clean scent of printer paper, a stark and welcome contrast to the cold, metallic sterility of the empire I left behind. In the corner of the room, sitting at a small, brightly painted wooden table, my 5-year-old daughter Rosie is happily coloring a picture of a yellow delivery truck. Through the open glass door, I can hear the lively, energetic hum of my team. Darius is barking cheerful orders to a fully unionized, fully insured dispatch crew. Felicia is laughing loudly with Owen over a newly optimized, incredibly efficient routing projection. They are not working here because I hold their livelihoods hostage or because they fear my temper. They return to my side because they chose to, drawn by a culture of absolute respect and transparency, rather than an atmosphere of terror. I did not win this war simply because I was a betrayed wife seeking petty vengeance. Anger burns out far too quickly, and jealousy is a terrible, unsustainable business strategy. I won because, in that freezing boardroom full of terrified executives and greedy accomplices, I was the only person who actually remembered what the original foundation was built upon. A true, lasting empire is never constructed from cheap ambition, stolen credit, or offshore shell companies. It is forged by genuine intellect, relentless labor, and a core of unyielding honor. And that is a legacy that can never be erased, diluted, or destroyed by a single pathetic phrase like my lover. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.